In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make this set with a hat and a circle scarf. To make this set, you need 2 balls of this yarn or 200 grams of yarn. The recommended needle is 5 mm, a 4.5 mm crochet hook and scissors. We start the hat from the top part, and we have to make a 6 puff stitch magic ring. We have to make the magic ring, chain 2, and we have to make a 4 loops puff stitch in the magic ring. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 loops, and we have to close all the loops together, close the stitch and chain 1. Repeat the same, 4 loops puff stitch in the magic ring. 1, 2, 3, 4 loops. We close all the loops together, close the stitch and chain 1. We have to repeat the same to have 6 puff stitches, separated by chain 1 between them. Once we have the 6 puff stitches, we have to make a slip stitch with the first puff stitch. We have to make a slip stitch to the chain 1 space, and we have to chain 2. Now in this row we have to make a puff stitch increase in all the chain 1 spaces. We have to make here 1 puff stitch, so we have to make 4 loops, close the 4 loops together, and here we have to make a chain 1, and in the same space we have to make the first increase. We will make the first V with the puff stitch. So we have to make another puff stitch. Here we have to make again 1 V with the puff stitch, but we don't have to make a chain 1 now. We only make chain 1 between the puff stitches of the V. So we have to make a puff stitch, close the stitch, chain 1. In the same space we have to complete the V. So we have to make again 1 puff stitch. We don't have to make a chain 1 now, and we have to repeat 1 V-stitch in the next chain 1 space. We have to repeat the same, making a V on each chain 1 space. Remember, chain 1 between the 2 puff stitches of the V, and we don't have to make any chain between the puff stitch of one V and the next V. Once we finished the row, we have to make a slip stitch with the first puff stitch, and we have to slip to the chain 1 space. We finished the second row. Row number 3, we start with chain 2. We have to make a V on the V, so we have to make a puff stitch, close the stitch, chain 1 because we are in the middle of the V, 1 puff stitch on the same space, completing the V. We don't have to make any chain now. We have to make a V on the next V. We skip this space and make 1 V on the chain 1 space of the following V. So we have to make a puff stitch here, close the stitch, chain 1, complete the V with a puff stitch, we have now 2 V's, and we have to make now one increase. To make the increase, we have to make a V between the 2 V's. We have to make a V on the space between the last puff stitch of the previous V and the first puff stitch of the next V. Here we have to make one V. Remember, chain 1 between the 2 puff stitches of the V. And this is what we have to repeat to the end of the row. 2 V's, 1 on each V, and 1 increase between the 2 V's. We are at the last space of the row where we have to make one increase. So we have to make a V, a puff stitch, a V puff stitch, so make one puff stitch, close the stitch, chain 1, one puff stitch on the same space, completing the V, and we finished the third row. We have to make a slip stitch with the first puff stitch and slip to the first chain 1 space. We have to start the row number 4 with chain 2, and in this row we have to make 3 V's and 1 increase. Remember, we have to make 1 V on the V, so here we have to make a puff stitch, close the stitch, chain 1, a puff stitch on the same space, completing the V, we don't have to make a chain 1 now, we have to make a puff stitch on the next chain 1 space. On the V of the previous row we have to make the puff stitch, chain 1, complete the V, we have now 2 V's, make the third V. Remember, a V on the V, we don't have to make a chain 1, make the first puff stitch, complete the stitch, close the stitch, chain 1 because we are in the middle of the V, complete the V with another puff stitch, and here we have to make one increase. Remember, to make the increase we have to make the V in the space between the 2 V's. And this is what we are going to repeat to the end. 3 V's and 1 increase. We make 1, 2 and 3 V's, and here between the and here on the space between the last V and the following V we have to make an increase, we have to make a V stitch. Here I finished the row making the last increase, and we have to make a slip stitch with the first puff stitch and slip, and we have to make a slip stitch to the chain 1 space. In this row we are going to make 4 V's and 1 increase. So we have to make 1 V, we have to make 1 puff stitch, close the stitch, chain 1, complete the V making another puff stitch in the same space, we don't have to make a chain 1 now, we have to go to the next chain 1 space, make 1 puff stitch, close the stitch, chain 1, complete the V with a puff stitch, repeat to have 4 V's, and once we have the 4 V's, we have to make 1 increase. Remember, we have to make the increase between the 2 V's. This is what we have to repeat to the end of the row, 4 V's and 1 increase. We have to continue making rows with increases to have 2 or 3 centimeters less than the size of the head. And you can make the hat on the size that you prefer, making more or less increases. For jumper, for me, I finished increasing, making 5 V's and 1 increase. But remember that you can make more or less increases using different yarn or different hook. From now to 4 centimeters before the length of the hat, we are going to make V's on the V's, and we don't have to make increases on these rows. We have to make a V stitch, making puff stitches. Remember, 1 puff stitch, close the stitch, chain 1, complete the V, we don't have to make a chain 1 now, we have to make a V on the next V stitch, make the first puff stitch, chain 1, complete the V, and we have to make, remember, rows to have 4 centimeters more or less before having the length of the head. Remember that you will have the shape of the hat, making more rows without increases. When you are making increases, you get the shape of a round. To make a hat, for me, I made 8 rows without increases. Remember that if you want a bigger hat, you can make more rows without increases, and if you want a smaller hat, you can make less rows without increases. Now we are going to make an edge, the knit stitch made with the crochet hook. We have to start making an edge of single crochet around with single crochet. We have to take the back loop of the stitch, we have to take only the back loop of the stitch, making 1 single crochet on each stitch that we have on the previous row. Where we have the V, we have to make 1 stitch on the puff stitch, 2 stitches in between the puff stitch and the puff stitch, and 1 stitch on the next puff stitch. Between the V's we only have 1 stitch, so we have to make 1 single crochet. Remember, always taking the back loop in this row. Now we have to make 5 rows with the knit crochet stitch. We have to take, instead of taking the stitch, we have to take the bar behind the stitch, this horizontal bar. We have to take this bar and make 1 single crochet. And we have to make 1 single crochet taking this bar behind the stitch in all the stitches, making 1 single crochet around, and you get a stitch like the knit stitch. And you get a stitch like the knit stitch. You have to make 5 rows making the knit stitch. Once we made the first row with the knit stitch, we have to make a slip stitch, chain 1, and continue making 4 more rows with the knit stitch. Remember taking the horizontal bar behind the single crochet. Making 1 single crochet, taking the horizontal bar behind the single crochet of the previous row. We will have at the end 6 rows with single crochet, the first row with the normal single crochet and 5 rows with the knit crochet stitch. And once we finish the 5 rows with the knit stitch, we can now cut the yarn. To make the circle scarf, we have to make a slip knot and we have to make 112 chains, a chain of 112. Now I am making a little sample to show you how to make the stitch, but you have to make a chain 112 to make an adult size. If you want to modify the size, you can make chains multiple of 4. This stitch is multiple of chain 4. Once we have the chain, we have to make a slip stitch with the first chain. Once you have the slip stitch, we have to make 1 single crochet on each single crochet, but you have to take the back part of the chain. Taking the back part of the chain, we have to make 1 single crochet around. Once you finished the row with single crochet, you have to make 3 more rows with the knit stitch in crochet. Remember, chain 1, and you have to make 1 single crochet on each single crochet, but taking the horizontal bar behind the stitch. 3 rows with the knit stitch. Once we finish the 3 rows with the knit stitch, we have to make now 1 row with the V puff stitch. We have to make 1 puff stitch here on the first chain, make the 4 loops, close the stitch, chain 1, complete the V making 1 puff stitch in the same space, 1 puff stitch in the same space, we don't have to make a chain now, we have to skip 3 stitches of the bottom part, skip 3 stitches, and on the stitch number 4 we have to make another V. So make 1 puff stitch, close the stitch, chain 1, and make again 1 puff stitch in the same space, completing the V. Once we finished the second V, we have to skip again 3 stitches of the bottom part and make 1 puff stitch on the stitch number 4. Once we made the last V, we have 3 stitches on the bottom part, and we have to make a slip stitch with the first puff stitch of this row. We have to make a slip stitch, we have to close this row. We have to slip to the chain 1 space, and we have to chain 2 and make 1 V on this V and continue making V's on the V's. So make a puff stitch, close the stitch, chain 1, complete the V making another puff stitch on the same space, and we have to make again, close the stitch and make the following puff stitch on the following V. We don't have to chain 1 now. And we have to make 10 rows with V's on the V's, 10 rows with the V puff stitch. Remember that if you want a bigger or smaller circle scarf, you can make more or less rows with the V stitch. And now we are going to make an edge with single crochet as we made with the hat. We have to make chain 1 and 1 single crochet on each stitch. Remember, taking only the back loop in all the row, taking the back loop, make 1 single crochet on each single crochet around, and we will have 3 rows with the knit stitch, with the crochet knit stitch, to complete the edge. And once we finish the edge, we finished the circle scarf. I hope you like it. Remember to give a like, share, subscribe, and click on the bell to receive the notifications of our new videos.